Well, welcome everybody. We appreciate your patience with us getting everyone seated. It's a full house, as you can see today, and so glad you're interested in this topic, birds in the wintertime, given by Laura Cazzo, who's a naturalist with Mass Audubon. I'd just like to remind people to silence their cell phones for the program and enjoy. So thank you, Laura.
Thank you. All right. Hi, everybody. Sarah said, we're today going to learn about the secret life of birds in winter. Mainly, I'm going to talk about some of the strategies that birds use to survive the winter, why some birds stay, why some birds go. All right, so my name is Laura Cazzo. I'm the adult programs teacher naturalist for the Metro South region of Mass Audubon. So that includes the Blue Hills Trailside Museum, Moose Hill Wildlife Sanctuary in Sharon, the Museum of American Bird Art, which I like to preface and say it's not a museum anymore, but they didn't let us change the name, so it is confusing, in Canton, and the Stony Brook Wildlife Sanctuary in Sharon. My background is I have a master's degree in ornithology, so I study birds. I also have a background in wildlife biology, so if you have non-bird related questions, I'm happy to answer those as well. So let's talk about winter survival in birds. Now, there are 4 main strategies that birds use when surviving over winter. The first one of these is physical adaptation. So birds have physical properties that allow them to survive winter, and we'll talk about some of those. They also have fat storage, which I separated from physical adaptations, as you'll see. They like to get chunky for the winter. Behavioral adaptation, so birds actually will change their behavior and how they act in the winter versus the spring and summer. And finally, migration, which I'm sure we all have some knowledge about, and I'm going to talk a little bit about winter migration and birds that go forth with winter migration. Before I get started, does anyone have any questions? No? Okay, great. So let's talk about physical adaptations of birds. I like this picture because it's little feet standing on ice. It's very cute. But birds' body temperature. So birds are warm-blooded, just like we are. They have a much higher They have a much higher metabolism, and that means that they have a higher body temperature than humans. So a bird's average body temperature is about 105 degrees, so much higher than us. And this temperature fluctuates a lot during the day, depending on climate, diet, and activity. So depending on what they eat in, depending how active they are, it affects their internal body temperature. So they have to be very careful about maintaining a proper temperature. Smaller birds, such as this hummingbird that's in this image, are at much higher risk because they have proportionally a larger surface area to their bodies and a smaller core, so they lose a lot of heat. And they are extremely active with a super high metabolism, so they can have a lot of struggles with heat. Like mammals, birds control their core body temperature for a fairly narrow range. So I said 105 is the average, which means that 102 to 109 is somewhere in the range of where their body temperature is. But the way that they keep their body temperature at that amount is actually having some different locations and different coverings of how they store their temperature. So it's kind of blurry, and I'm sorry about that. This is a hawk image, and you can see in the infrared that when we look at the inside of the wing and at the core body, and then this is the inside of the wing, and this is a human hand, that there's a lot of heat in the core, face, and in the inside of the wings. But the minute the bird closes the wings, we only see heat temperatures maybe in the feet, and the wings are covering it. So there's not a lot of heat lost because the wings are actually like a jacket. They're holding it all inside. So the birds are able to maintain their higher temperature in colder climates, oh, it's an osprey, by just closing their wings, and it's really effective. But of course, when they're flying, they don't have that ability. So when they're moving and flying, Just like the hummingbird in this picture, they're losing a lot of heat in their extremities, just how like when you go outside in the cold, your fingers and toes get cold before anything else. But birds have a couple other ways that they keep warm in the winter. And one of those is insulation against the cold with extra feathers that they grow for the winter. So in the winter, birds that are staying here actually grow this late fall molt, and they grow a lot more body feathers for thicker insulated protection. And you can see here our lovely blue jay is looking kind of poofy and fluffed up. And that's because birds do this very specific thing to trap heat inside. So birds, when it's cold, will fluff up their feathers and trap air pockets between the feathers. And their internal body temperature will heat up those air pockets, trapping the warmth inside their feathers. So the birds will actually, though they didn't gain any more weight, well, actually they gained a little weight in the winter, but they're not gaining enough for you really to be able to notice the difference. The reason the birds look so puffy is because they're actually fluffing themselves up so they can stay warm in the winter. It's the same concept as jackets. Which one of these guys looks like they're gonna get warmer? Which jacket's gonna keep you warmer? So down jackets do the same thing as bird feathers. They're filled with fluff or feathers, and your body temperature will trap the air between the feathers and warm it up. So it's the exact same concept. So that's why fluffy down jackets are going to keep you warmer than something like a fleece jacket, because the fleece jacket is not trapping any air. It's just keeping you as warm as possible with the limited space that it has. So chunky, floofy birds are one of the main things you're going to see in the winter because these guys are just acting like they have that down jacket, and they do. It's built into their systems already on. Another way birds are going to stay warm in the winter and how they adapt is actually waterproofing. So we know that most ducks, loons, and other seabirds have this waterproofing, but most birds just have this in general. They have what's called urethral gland. It's an essential part of the bird's anatomy, and it contributes to waterproofing. It's right above their booty, and it essentially releases an oil that the bird will lean back, grab onto the gland, collect some of the oil on their beak before running their feathers through their beak. So they're taking this oil and coating each of their feathers with this oil. Both, water birds and non-water birds do this. Water birds, it's really important, and their secretions from the gland are going to be slightly different because they really need to be able to be buoyant and float in the water. In fact, if you have a bird that's been unable to do this for a while, so when I worked in wildlife rehab, we would get birds that were unable to move or preen themselves, or if they had a broken leg, it was harder to do this. Before we could release them, we had to make sure they waterproofed themselves again. And sometimes the only way to do that is to get them a little damp. So they're like, oh, that's right, I don't like this. So that they'll redo it. But it's really handy for the winter because it basically means that the snow and the rain is not going to get through their feathers as quickly. It's just, it's the lining of the jacket, basically. It's the water is going to slide right off of it. You can kind of see the snowflakes are only lightly sticking to the outer edges of this bird, but mostly they're gonna fly off. They're not piling up or anything like that, and they're not going to actually instantly melt either. They're gonna slide off with wind and so on. Now, another physical adaptation is birds' feet. So birds actually have very distinct ways that the heat in their feet work, which is really interesting. Because if you're a bird and you're outside in the winter, you're probably standing on ice and snow. And I don't know about you guys, but when I'm outside in the winter, I like to have boots on because otherwise your feet get really cold. And if you did this for so long, you'd get frostbite. But birds don't get frostbite. They can do this for months at a time, especially those birds that live in the Arctic. This is because birds' feet are covered with specialized scales to minimize heat loss, and they can also control the temperature in their legs and feet, which, how wild is that? So let's take this example of a very cute dog. When we and mammals go out into the snow, what happens is our feet are going to hit the snow, and our feet are warm and the snow is cold. So instantly there's going to be whichever is more powerful is going to dictate the temperature of your foot. So if the snow is really, really, really cold, your foot is going to start getting really, really cold. If your body is warmer than the ground, then your foot's not going to get as cold. But basically what happens is you have the warm blood running down into your foot, and it's still in your foot, but the snow and ice is causing the blood to get colder, and then it's traveling back up and it has to warm back up in your body. So it's not very efficient, and what's going to happen is that means that the warmth of your foot is going to melt some of the snow, and then it's going to stick to your feet as well. So just like this little dog, the heat is sticking to the foot. But birds have what's called this counter heat exchange in their legs. And they have a bunch of extra veins in their legs that essentially cool down the blood in their feet so that it's the same temperature as the ice. And when your foot is the same temperature as the ice, it's not going to stick to the ice, and you're not actually going to feel anything. So basically, you'll see that there's multiple branching in the arteries, and they're twining all into each other. And then before it even reaches the foot, the blood has started to get pretty cold. So that when it's in the foot, it's, again, the same temperature as the ice. And when two things are the same temperature, neither's going to melt, neither's going to stick. So that's why ducks can stand on the ice and not get stuck. So then once it leaves the foot, the veins bring it back up. This counter heat exchange again happens in the leg, and the warm blood continues to flow through the bird. It's actually quite complicated, the process of this. So this is the simplest way to go through it. So the blood is keeping the feet relatively cool. This diagram gives you like a good idea of the temperatures. Now it is in Celsius. So 33 degrees Celsius is about 100 degrees. Because the internal bird's temperature is like 105 degrees. So just in a single foot, we're starting out with 35 degrees Celsius, the main average temperature of the bird. Throughout the foot, we are dropping temperatures of blood until we reach 1 degree Celsius, which, if you know, Celsius 0 degrees is freezing. So freezing temperatures before it goes back up the vein and reaches again, normal body temperatures. And this is how ducks are able to hang out on really cold surfaces. It's pretty crazy, right? In case you've ever wondered. Next on our list of ways birds survive the winter is fat storage, or what I call the let's get chunky time in the fall. So throughout the summer, birds are, for the most part, and most of the birds that we have up here, trying to get as much meat as possible, maybe fruits as possible. If you're a hummingbird, you're getting nectar, and you're just eating all the time. But in the summer, you're eating so that if you're a male bird, you'll look really good, so all the females will want to be with you. And if you're a female bird, you're eating a lot of food so that you have the energy to lay eggs. And then you're eating even way more food than that to feed all your babies. So there's a lot of food needed during those very expensive times. But when you start getting closer to winter, you're moving away from energy that you need to use up right away, and instead moving towards energy that you need to store to use later. Now, a bird that I like to give an example of this is actually our state bird, which is the black-capped chickadee. So in the spring and summer, these guys are gonna gorge themselves on insects. But then once fall starts coming, they're gonna go for berries. Why? Well, berries have high sugar content. So if you want to store a lot of stuff, you want to eat a lot of sugar. So these are high in glucose while the insects are high in protein. You want protein too, but also in the fall, it's going to be a lot harder to get the insects. So you start really eating mostly berries and storing up as much as you can. And then if you stay here in the winter, you're going to eat seeds. Now, seeds do not provide as much energy. You need a lot more of them to get the nutrients out. It's not like these birds are eating cashews. They're eating sunflower seeds and anything they can find outside that's in the grasses. So it takes a lot more seeds to keep going, which is why the diet of these birds change throughout the year. Like I almost have to sneeze, but it's just not happening. Success. All right. So seasonal diet, eat seasonally, I think maybe some of you have heard say, because your diet's going to change if you're a bird throughout the season. For winter, you want to get plump, for lack of a better term. Now, this is a chart that biologists use to actually determine what we call the fat score of a bird. And by doing this, we're actually checking to see how healthy the bird is. So we have at the end there emaciated, which means that there's no fat storage. This bird is in the wildlife rehab. We are tube feeding it, basically, is where we are there. Then we have thin. We're probably still tube feeding, but maybe it can eat on its own. Reasonable and good are what we're looking for. That's what it's in the wild when they're fine. Plump is not a thing that exists outside of people who have a pet bird and are overfeeding it. So this is just a very, very short chart, and there's a much longer system that I'll show you in about a second. But the way that you can see fat on birds is that it is actually a color and it is actually yellow. And they store their fat around here. This is the bottom, like this is the beak of the bird. They're laying on its back. They store the fat in areas around here. They're not storing it in their wings. They're not even necessarily storing it like in their stomach, which is where I hold on mine. They're storing it on their main body. Now, the actual scores go up to 8. So we have 0 to 8. So it's like a much more broad range. And in a minute, I'll show a picture of this. But if you're a bird, you want to get as chunky as possible for the winter, because the more fat that you have on when winter starts, the less need to stress out about food you have. So you want to make sure that as a bird, you're somewhere in the 4 to 6 range, with the colored parts being fat. So you want to have a good amount of fat on your body so you can burn it away. You don't want too much, because then you're going to be too fat and not able to maybe avoid predators and so on. Like it's not a good thing to have that too much. You really only see that if a bird is in captivity and has constant access to food or is being overfed. In the wild, they're moving around so much, you never really see too chunky a bird. And this is a pretty good example of the differences in fat buildup. These birds are in captivity, which is why we have a completely chunk bird. We can see almost no fat in this image. Now, what we're doing in this picture is we're actually holding the birds in one hand. Their head is between the fingers. I think this image you can kind of see their heads between the fingers, their feet are captured down below, and you actually blow. You blow on the bird's feathers so the feathers come apart, because otherwise there'd be feathers covering this. So you blow gently on the feathers and it opens this area up. These pictures are not very good because you really gotta like do a lot to like look at the whole area. But it doesn't hurt the birds. You're holding them securely. You know, we're holding them with their head between our fingers, but it's very gentle. They're not hurt at all. But these are 2 images of, I believe, birds that were part of a study. And in this one, we can see that this might be the same bird. I don't know. I couldn't find information on these pictures so much, but there's almost no yellow. There's very little fat storage. This might be what a bird would look like right before going into the spring. This is still healthy. It's still plump. It's not emaciated. If it was emaciated, it'd be super curved in. And this bird is filled with fat. So that yellow is just all the fat that's sitting there. Again, captivity, so you don't see any pink in that. But even small birds can build up fat reserves, which also helps with generating body heat. So at the same time as you're using that energy because you don't have enough food, you want to store up as much as you can so you can generate body heat throughout the winter. So getting chunky, important for birds. But then there's behavioral adaptation. So birds actually do change their behavior in the winter in order to survive. And one of the main things that they do is called mixed species flocks. So in the spring and the summer, the birds' main focus, and when I say the birds, I'm talking about birds here in Massachusetts. If I was talking about the tropics or other areas, it could be completely different. But the birds that we have up here in the spring and summer are focused on breeding and then preparing for the winter again. You know, they have their very distinct life cycle. And they are defending territories, they're building nests, they're mating. Some of the birds are only mating for a season, and they become very territorial, and they don't have any interest in other species of bird. In the winter, though, they change their behavior because it becomes advantageous to change your behavior in the winter by joining up with other birds. So let's say this is your backyard and you have a tree and it's fall, it's winter, there's a couple things left. And in the tree, you have a tufted titmouse and it's scrounging around for food. You also have another tree and you have a bird feeder and there's tons of other birds, many different birds with many different species of birds that are all together. They're all feeding at the same feeders. They're in the same trees. This is not something you're going to see as much in the spring and summer. In fact, if you pay attention to your feeders, there's going to be more species that you're going to see at the feeder together in the winter, and in the summer, they're going to switch off. You might see one species of bird there, and then they'll leave and a different one's going to come up. But in the winter, they're all going to forage together. Why? Why did they change this behavior? Well, it's because of the enemies, like the cats and the hawks. And the sentinel species, in this case our tufted titmouse, is on the lookout. And he, or I guess or she, but mostly he's, are gonna see the predators first, and they're going to release an alarm call that all the other birds understand what that means. Not just the other tufted titmice, also the chickadees and the goldfinches and even the woodpeckers and the cardinals are all gonna hear this call so that they know that they have to leave. And they're not going to be like, what's the danger? Tell me what it is. They're just like, goodbye. They're not trying to figure it out. There is some speculation, and some birds actually have different alarm calls for an aerial predator versus like a ground predator. But the birds are all gonna leave, including our sentinel species, and that is how the predators don't get anything to eat. It's a complete change in behavior. They don't do this in the spring and summer as much. It's mixed species flocks really only take place from the fall through the winter, and then the minute all the birds want to mate again, they're like, goodbye friends, you're my enemy now. I have to get all the ladies, and then they'll meet up again in the fall. It's not necessarily the same groups of individual birds in a group every year. It might not even be any of the same, but you'll see certain groups of birds at your feeders in the winter. So juncos often are there with house finches. Are often there with chickadees and titmice and downy woodpeckers, and they form these groups of mixed species flocks. Not all the birds do this. Some birds have no interest in that, no matter what time of year it is, but you do get a good look at that during this time of year. A couple other behaviors that you really are only going to see in winter. You will see tucking behavior in the summer, especially on colder days, but it's not unusual to see a bird covering both its legs with its feathers and then putting their beak inside their feathers They tuck their bills into their shoulder for protection and to actually breathe warm air from their own body heat that's trapped in the pockets of their feathers. So you can barely see this bird. But its little eyeball is like right there and its whole head is tucked in, and then it's just a giant fluff. Here's a good image of a swan doing this behavior. You can see how it's mostly curled up in each other, probably just wanting to take some breaths of warm air. This bird is obviously still sitting on the water, so it's not doing itself any favors, but another behavior that they will do to keep warm. Sunning on wintry days, many birds take advantage of solar heat. So again, you're going to see this in the summer too. The cormorants will warm themselves by spreading their wings in in the summer after they've been diving. They go down so deep that the water is pretty cold actually, so you have to warm back up. But chickadees will do this. All the birds will actually do this, especially on like a warmer day. Like yesterday was a weird warm day. This winter is super weird and warm. But they will open their wings and they will let the sun heat them up, think kind of like a reptile. And they'll make some really weird body shapes when they do this because they want to turn their back to expose it to the sun. And they've raised their feathers slightly, allowing the sun to kind of get between their feathers more efficiently. They might drop a wing and raise another one. They'll do this like weird twisting motion. It's really, this picture probably describes it best, trying to get as much surface area as possible for the sun to hit, and therefore warm them up. Birds also do shiver. So we shiver. It's to raise your metabolic rate. When you get really cold, when I get really cold, my hands start to shake uncontrollably. It's shivering. It's because movement helps warm you up from the inside out. So if you move around, so birds will shiver. It's a short-term solution to the extreme cold. They will uncontrollably shiver. It's pretty hard to visualize and you don't really ever catch it on camera, but shivering requires a lot more calories, so you're burning a lot of fat when you're shivering, so it's not something you want to do, but in extreme conditions, when it's just absolutely, when nothing else, for brief periods of time, or in areas where there's a lot of food, so you like can keep storing, like you can keep getting energy from food. Shivering is a really good way for these birds to warm up when they're cold. They will also roost, so these birds will spend a good amount of time on their own, but when it's cold, they will spend time clustered together. So they will, these are actually, I don't know if you can tell, these are chimney swifts that are all piled on top of one another. So that's what that image is. So they're all piled on top of one another. They're clustering together. They're using each other's body heat to stay warm. So it's not just penguins that do this. Other birds will do this in the cold as well. This is a really great picture of tree swallows. Very likely in like a freak storm because these guys don't like the cold. And one bird will pick a spot and then they're all gonna smush together as best as they can to stay warm. Torpor. So this is basically hibernation and it conserves energy during cold winter night. It is pretty rarely seen in birds. It does happen, but only a few species of birds do this. And other species are only going to do it if they're in distress. So hummingbirds are really only ever going to do this if they're in a distress situation. They're going to like basically enter this feat of their calories slowing down exponentially. So it's going to really, really, really slow down. And therefore it requires fewer calories to maintain heat, because if you are burning metabolism so slowly, you don't need as many calories. Most birds can lower their temperature by a couple degrees. Some birds can do it as much as 50 degrees can lower their temperature and really like enter this state. But greater vulnerability to any bird that has a super fast metabolism, so hummingbirds and swifts and so on, this is really dangerous. But basically, it's just like a very, very deep sleep. The birds that really do this are the goat suckers. They're a group of birds that include the common whippoorwill and a couple other ones that we have here in Massachusetts. And basically, they're just going to like settle down, and they might do this all night. They might do it into the day. If it's a really like hard day, they might do it for a couple days at a time. They're just going to fall into basically a trance-like sleep where they're going to slow their metabolism, stay through the night, experience this very dreamlike situation. Blending in really good with the background is important because otherwise the predator is just going to get you because you won't be paying attention. So those are a lot of the behavioral adaptations people do. Our last one to talk about before we watch a little short video that I'm going to pull up is migration. So a lot of people think that the birds just simply migrate because they don't want to deal with the cold, and that is true. But the thing is all the birds, regardless, have these tactics to deal with the cold. The main reason that birds migrate is food. That's the number one reason that birds migrate. There's not a lot of food in the winter. Hummingbirds, there's no nectar, there's no flowers, there's little insects. So the main reason birds migrate is in fact food. If a bird, some species, feel that there's enough food, they might not migrate, or they might not migrate as far. I never used to see bluebirds hanging here over the winter. I often see bluebirds in the winter now because there's enough food. It's not getting as cold. There's plenty of food for them to find, so they're actually hanging around. But migration is essentially the seasonal movement of animals from one habit to another in search of food, better conditions, or reproductive needs. Why don't our birds go to Costa Rica and go, this is nice, I'm not coming back. Why don't I raise my kids here? Because the birds of Costa Rica are already taking up all the space. The birds of Central and South America often don't wait seasonally to reproduce. Some of them do, wet, dry season, but they can do it all year. So they don't have to think about weather as much. But they're taking up all the space. They've already declared all the territories. The interlopers from the east coming down are eating their food, but they're not doing territories or anything like that. So they're not. So our birds are not staying in those areas because there's no room for them to stay. There's no room for them to reproduce there. But migration happens all over the globe. This is actually barn swallow migration. Barn swallows are not just in the US, they're also in Europe. And you can see that up and down and up and down is essentially the idea behind migration. They're moving across these large spans of territory over a short period of time. Now I'm going to focus in on two specific bird species that I'm going to talk about for migration before we switch, take a brief pause while I set up the other thing and talk about a little other, some bird behaviors and where you can see some birds here in Massachusetts in the winter, which mainly I'm going to show you on the internet. But purple martins. So you can see purple martins at the Stony Brook Wildlife Sanctuary in the summer. We have purple martin boxes. These are a type of swallow, so they're close to tree swallows and barn swallows. Very distinct purple coloration, beautiful birds, very pretty birds. They are really big on being near sources of water, which makes sense because their main source of food is insects. So they're really not eating seeds, they're not eating berries. They might eat berries in the fall, but for most of the year, they are going to feed off insects. They love dragonflies, they love mosquitoes, they love those weird little water bugs, and they catch their food on the fly. So these guys have very aerodynamic wings, and they can do these really intense, crazy movements through the air. that they can use to catch the insects right out of the air. They're a species of relatively low concern right now. We are monitoring their populations because there is concern that they might be dropping. But these guys have a huge migration, and they actually like each other. So they migrate in pretty big groups, and they even nest in pretty big groups. So they'll actually gather together and migrate down for the winter. Now, I did just mention that most of them are migrating because of food resources. Not everybody, okay? They are and they aren't. They are waiting till the angle of the sun is just right to start their migration. So the days get shorter. That's how the birds decide when they're gonna migrate. They don't have dates. They don't know when September begins, but they know how the angle of the sun goes. So they're gonna know when it's time to move south for the winter. Our other birds, like some other species of birds, are not going to follow the angle of the sun. They're just going to follow food. So if there's enough food, they're not going to go. These guys are like, the sun has changed. It is time to move on. And they have an absolutely fascinating migration. So this is a video map. And it actually starts in January, and I'm going to walk through this in a second, how it works and where exactly these birds go. But they have a very fascinating migration because they'll go all the way down to Brazil. So this map starts in December, and as you can see, there's no birds located on this map. This is an abundance map. The darker the color, the more abundance of birds in one place. This is because we don't know that much about where exactly they are in South America. Harder to track, harder to do things, not as much things. So, but we know that they're there. So January, February, March, they start moving up. June, July, they're up here. In September, October, November, they're back down. They're actually flying from Florida to the islands and then down. They're not necessarily going all the way around. What a waste of energy when you can fly, right? So again, January, February, March, April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, December. And they're almost all of them are in this basin area of the Amazon rainforest. But these guys, like I said, they're really, really insect dependent. So when they're coming back from the winter, they have to follow the insects. So when they go down to South America, they're also eating bugs. They have these insane mouths. Swifts have really interesting natural history. They have these very wide mouths that are ready to eat the dragonflies, and they actually produce a specific kind of mucus that the parents have to give to the children so they can digest things properly. It's real weird. But they have to follow the insects back. So this is just another map that shows kind of the timeline of where they might be. I don't know, and I disagree a little bit with the January and February locations, so just take this with a grain of salt. But if we are assuming that in January they're still in Brazil and they're hanging out, enjoying the warm weather, they are going to start moving north. It's a pretty long journey. They're going to have to start in like February. So in February, they might get to here. I think that's a huge exaggeration. I would say that they're here in March. But this map says that they actually get up to like almost Virginia in March. Because, and I lived in Virginia for several years, they actually have spring. We don't have spring. We have wet and sad. But Virginia has spring. They have cherry blossoms, and their cherry blossom festival is in March, end of March. So there are insects by March in Virginia. Not a lot. But the martins are going to slowly follow this up. By April, New Jersey, beautiful in April, tons of flowers. May is finally when they're going to reach New England, because by May we better have some insects or all the birds are really going to be confused. So it's very specific, following the track of where the insects are going to come. Now, January, like I said, this part is a little rougher. There's probably actually insects. There are insects all year round in Florida. That does not mean that the martins are staying. The martins are like, nope, we're going all the way to Brazil. We like it there. So a little bit of a funky map. But purple martins are colony nesters, so in the spring and the summer, they're gonna come back and they love these gourd-like nests, but they nest in big colonies. So we actually have a structure like this at the Stony Brook Wildlife Sanctuary that you can go see. They all nest together, and they'll always be flying around and catching the insects to feed their young. So that is one other strategy of migration to get away from the cold. I think it's the ideal one. I would also go to Costa Rica all winter, given the opportunity. But it's also very costly. It takes a lot of energy to go those distances. They are clearly eating a ton of protein to be able to move down and around in those locations. But then there are birds who take a different strategy, but it's also the same strategy. So we're still talking about migration, but let's talk about the snow bunting. You can see snow buntings here in Massachusetts. I have seen them. Very cool, weird little birds. I like them a lot. They're grain eaters. I'll go to the slide. They live in grassland areas. They're grain eaters, so they spend a lot of time pulling the seeds out of grass. So different type of energy. They're not eating insects, so it's a slower form of digestion. It takes a lot longer to pull the energy out of a seed than it does from an insect. But they spend all year eating seeds, and they will. I like to call most birds opportunistic omnivores. If it fits in their mouth, they're gonna eat it. So I would never say like a snow bunting would never eat an insect. It might, given the opportunity. But for the most part, they're gonna hang in areas where they are pulling the seeds out of the grass. These guys also migrate. They form bigger groups. If you've ever seen a group of snow buntings flying, it's a weird experience. The patterns of their feathers makes it really dizzying to look at. It's like quite confusing and scattered and a little bit all over the place. But they will migrate in groups. But they don't migrate to South America. They migrate to here. And there's the big difference. This map is a little tilted slightly. I don't know why they did that. It actually drives me crazy. But it starts in January, and we can see that there is populations. Massachusetts is so handy because of the Cape, that come in January, that come to Massachusetts in the winter, because where they go in the summer is so much worse. So January, February, March, April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, December. So these guys, their migration is to come here. That is their winter strategy because it's so much worse in Upper Canada where they actually nest. So I like to talk about this because I don't know if a lot of people think about this a lot of the time, how it's warmer here than other places. So birds are actually migrating to here for the winter. This is the best map example that I could find. Other good examples of birds who come here for the winter are juncos, dark-eyed juncos. We don't have them in the summer. They go and breed really high up north as well. So some birds are coming here for the winter to employ all their strategies because, like I said, these guys are seed eaters. These guys are going to strip the grass of their seeds in the winter and continue doing that all through summer. So they don't need to do as much change in diet. They just need to be able to find seeds. So a really easy place to go see these guys actually is on the drive up to Montreal is where I've seen these. We are getting too warm for them to come here because it's a little easier as a bird to stay warm than cool down. We as well. It's a lot easier to put on a sweater than to remove your skin from your body when it's really hot out, right? Same with birds. It's easier for them to stay warm than get cold. So it's actually getting a little too warm for some of these birds to continue coming down. But other birds that come for the winter, and slightly switching gears here, is ducks. I love ducks. I think they're the best. And these are the ducks that come down during the winter. So we have a lot of really cool ducks that only visit during the winter months. They're doing the same thing. They're up in Canada, they're breeding up in Canada, and then they're coming down here, and actually most of them change from freshwater to saltwater in the winter. So this duck, this one up here, anyone seen that duck before? One or two people. That's a harlequin duck. They breed on rapid rivers up in Canada, so rapidly moving water up in Canada. In fact, the babies are born basically pretty much ready to go, and they jump into the rapidly moving water almost right after they're born. And that's how they survive. So these guys are gonna come down to Massachusetts in the winter, but we don't have those rapid moving streams, but we have waves. So these guys can actually, I've seen them off the coast in Gloucester, and you can see them on the waves. So they'll spend the time out on the waves. Loons, both common loons that maybe you guys have seen up in Maine, and red-necked loons, those are a thing, will spend time offshore here in Massachusetts as well. So these loons will mostly just hang along the coastline. I saw them all the time when I was at URI as an undergrad. They just kind of float around. Eiders, you go to any Newburyport, you go to Gloucester again, you go to Ipswich, you're gonna see these guys hanging out by the boats. They're gonna be trying to snatch fish from the boats. And then you're gonna get your scoters and the other birds all doing the same thing. They're all coming down because it's warmer here than it is back home. And I have made you guys a map if you want to go see ducks in the winter. And I'll pull this up at the end. So if you like ducks like I do, you might want to go see some ducks in our area. And these are some of the top places to see wintering ducks. All the darker blue ones are Mass Audubon locations, and the lighter blue ones are just other great locations you can go to. All kind of scattered about. You don't actually have to go to these places to see ducks, but you can find some places like ponds with fresh water. You might not see all of them, but you can see some ruddy ducks. You can see many different kinds of ducks. And if you want this map on your phone, you can scan this, and it will just take you to the Google Maps document that I've made for everyone if you want to be able to go to these locations. This is all for my main part of the lecture. It's about 5 minutes to 2:30. Yes, our favorite winter ducks, obviously. Any questions? Oh, a couple. Yes.
I wanted to know, you said that some of the ducks go from freshwater to saltwater. Do they have to?
Yes and no. Some of them are going to saltwater because saltwater isn't going to freeze. So harlequin ducks are living on the rivers and catching food in the rivers. But in the winter, it gets miserably cold up there in Canada. So they're coming down to the oceans. They still want the rapid moving water. We're not going to have the rivers that they want. So they like go to the salt water because the waves are going to like replicate their natural habitat. So I don't know if I would say they have any specific adaptations like that. No, because it's half of their life is spent on the ocean when you think about the fact that they are in winter for half of the year. So I don't, as far as I know, no. I'm trying to think off the top of my head, like the eiders and some of these other birds will spend the spring and summer in freshwater and the winter on saltwater. And I don't know if there's any like, I'm just trying to think if there'd be any like secretions that might like, protect them from the salt, because salt water is just so much harsher, but no one's ever asked me before. So I don't know. It's something I'd have to look into. I do know that it does make it hard. It's harder to survive on salt water than it is on freshwater, which is probably why they raise their young on freshwater. It might be as simple as that, but I have no idea. Other questions? Yes.
I have heard and know that seagulls have to come.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so all the birds. So the question was the gulls have to go find fresh water every day. Yeah, so yeah, any of these birds that are staying on the salt water are gonna go have to find fresh water. They can't just drink the salt water. They don't have like a filtering system for that. So they they will go find freshwater, but I think they can go like a lot longer, depending on some of these birds. They're not going to go to shore often. A really good example of why these birds don't go onto shore often. I love the internet. I really do. Let's look at this picture of this. What happened? It did. It was like, we're not going to do this for you now. Is a lot of these birds are only designed to, why? All right. Well, if you're a duck, your feet are not always centered in your body like a mallard. A lot of the seabirds, their legs are actually further back. Perfect for swimming. Really hard to walk on the land. So finding fresh water is going to be a matter of flying, landing in the water, flying, and going back. Some of them also just drink rainwater when it rains. So it's kind of tricky. This is one of those like biological things that I like to say, I don't know, they switch it up. They have to survive, so they're going to find a way to do it. But yeah, they're all going to have to go get fresh water. They can't drink the salt water. Yes. You answered your own question. It's dependent on the species. It depends on wind. It depends on food availability on the journey. Some of them are going several hundred miles. Some of them might only do a couple. It's really dependent on species individuals and on all the resource availability. Yeah. So it kind of just depends. Yes. So the question is, are there specific plants that you use to attract birds to your yard? The very simple answer is native plants. You know, it's just plant anything that's native to Massachusetts, so native flowers, native grasses. People often forget about the native grasses. Like if you want to attract seed eaters to your yard, you want to plant some of these native grasses, some of the taller grasses. But basically just the very simple answer is plant native, and that's how you're going to attract more birds to your yard. Yes, all the way in the back. Loons mostly go up to Maine in the summer, but I've seen them in New Hampshire. They can be here. I don't know what the loon was doing calling at this time of year. It's confused. But it's definitely possible. The loons are here in the winter, but they're usually on the coast. They have to get fresh water sometimes. Answering some migration questions, birds migrate in a lot of different ways. Some birds have a special chemical compound, including iron in their brains and their inner ears, that allows them to sense Earth's magnetic field, and that's how they're able to migrate. Some of them just have geographic mapping, so they follow the same migration route year after year. They just follow their parents who followed their parents who followed their parents, and so they actually start to recognize land formations and so on, and that's how they know to migrate. And some actually learn the sun and the stars, and migrate by the stars, which is why light pollution is like a really big deal for migrating birds. Cities can really throw a bird off. I was trying to see if I had information on how high they go, but I think it's kind of variable there. This is what, just to go back into like, if a lot of these birds come on land to find fresh water. This is what a loon's legs, look how far back they are, and a lot of ducks actually have, this is an extreme example, loons are a pretty extreme example of this. These guys cannot really walk on land well at all. Their front end, they kind of like shuffle along their front end and push off the back. They're made for going underwater and diving and for swimming. So that's why we're going from streams to the ocean to maybe freshwater patches, but we're not spending a lot of time on land. You know, mallards and other ducks obviously have more centered feet, but a lot of the ducks that spend most of their time on the water have legs that don't allow them to do much on land. Other questions? A couple more. Yes.
Everybody's wearing these puffer coats,
Yeah.
jackets,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm
just wondering, where do they get all the feathers for these puffer coats? Do they,
Like human, like the human, actual human. Well, some is goose down. You can get a goose down jacket, and others I think is synthetic. Yeah, they have synthetic jackets made from.
synthetic?
Yeah, yeah, like basically like plastic. Yeah, and then there's goose down. You can get a goose down jacket for sure.
So, my son lives near the native woods, and there's a couple of bodies of water there. So in the past, I've noticed that the swans leave in the winter. This year, the swans still-
Well, just so you know, those swans are likely mute swan and are invasive species from Europe, and we don't want them here. So they do whatever they want. They don't have specific migrations and things like that because they're introduced species to the US. So I also don't know a lot about them because we don't learn a lot about invasive species except how to get rid of them, which I know a lot of people don't want to hear about swans, but they are invasive. The mute swans that we have around here are invasive, so they might stay, they might go. We don't know. They're just kind of doing whatever they want to do to adapt. Yes?
buildings at night negatively affect.
Yeah, it's very, very simple. If you're a bird and you are flying at night and you're using the directionals of the stars or the moon, an actual really good example, this is turtles, which I know is not a bird, but great example. Hatching turtles go towards the ocean instinctually, right? We've all seen the videos maybe of like the turtles, they hatch out of the water and they head towards the ocean. How do they know to go towards the ocean? It's because the stars and the moon reflect off the water. So there actually is light that they're headed towards. Water gives off light at night because the moon and stars reflect on water. If you have a beach with an ocean and then you have a city right behind it, that's how the turtles get confused, and a lot of them don't make it because they're heading towards light and the city light is overtaking the other type of light. Same with birds. Like the birds might be using the stars to navigate. They might be using other sources. They might be using sources of water if they're going over the water. And because of light pollution, like large cityscapes, they're getting confused and lost because the light is kind of messing with them. Yeah. Yeah, I know you had a question in the back. Yeah. I don't know. No. Why are there so many turkeys? The very simple answer is we've destroyed so much of their habitat that they're leaving the woods and coming in to look for food because this used to be their home. This used to be forest, and this is where they used to live. And we cut it down and built houses here, and now this is where they live. And there's not enough forested areas for all the turkeys to stay in the forest. And also, we have Doritos, which are like delicious. So they're gonna find food in these areas instead. Oh, that's such a good question, and it's such much of a longer talk, but very simply, some species adapt better to urbanization than others. So pigeons are not a good example because we just domesticated them. Ospreys have very easily adapted to urbanization because they just started to build their nests on telephone poles, and they weren't really bothered by people. Saw-whet owls really don't come, they can't see when there's any type of light. They're super light sensitive, so just the buildings of a simple like house is going to drive them off. So it's really just as simple as some adapt better to urbanization than others. Yes?
How do birds do up in the Arctic? There are no trees up there. They have to be big birds to be able to eat the fish.
Well, the birds that are going to be in the Arctic are penguins, and that's a completely different kind of surviving the winter. They have blubber. Well, they have not blubber, that's like whales, but they have a super thick layer, completely different from the birds that we have here. Yeah, in the summer, which is still cold, but it's not miserable temperatures. So they're going up to Bassett Island for breeding, and they're just going to use all the same strategies that they used that I went over to survive there, and they can. They just have the ability to adapt to that, but they're migrating down when it gets really, really cold up there. I think they eat grasses. Yeah, because these are the snow buntings that the map that you're talking about are the snow buntings. So they're eating the grass seeds. So they're pulling it out of the ground. Any other questions? Yes. Of the wings? Of like the wings and everything? Oh God, it's kind of like an X-ray machine, but for temperature. I don't know exactly what the machine is called, but it's like a heat sensor. Yeah. Yeah, it's like a live thing that you point at the bird. I don't know what they're called. I'm kind of blanking on it. Infrareds, things like that. Yeah. I've never done that before. Yeah.
How do birds know that cold weather or severe weather is coming?
So that's the daylight changing. So they know winter is coming because the days start to get shorter. If you mean the birds that stay here, I think a lot of it is just instinct. They, know that winter is coming because they have suddenly the desire to eat a lot more fruit, and they start growing in feathers that protect them for the winter. The migrating ones follow the light of the sun, and as the daylight decreases is when they're going to start moving, and that's really how they're mostly going to tell that winter is coming. Either way, daylight decreases, winter is coming.
Well, they're better weather people than the weathermen.
Yeah.
Before a storm, it becomes very
Oh, how do they tell like right before a storm? No clue. That is one of life's great mysteries, how the animals know. It's just one of those mysteries. I mean, there's a lot of theories that it's, again, like magnetic pulses. It's pressure, like that they can have like inner ear pressure that's just like a lot better than ours. So that if something's coming, the air pressure feels different and they can sense that. But I don't know if we have solid answers for that one yet. All right, one more, yeah.
Have you noticed any changes with the birds now the weather is changing and the climate is changing, and how can they adapt to that? And have you seen them adapt to any of these?
So I mentioned before, like the bluebirds are staying longer. So some of these birds are adapting by not migrating, not leaving, just staying in the area. That's one form of adaptation. But for the most part, the biggest problem is climate change is happening faster than evolution. And so the birds are not adapting well. So this is actually a really good image for this exact concept. So the birds are not changing when they're coming back from migration because they're migrating with the angle of the sun. So just like they figure out when winter is coming by the angle of the sun, that's also how they figure out that spring is coming. So they're like, oh, excellent, the days are getting longer, it's time to head back. So the birds are always arriving around the same time. They're not coming back earlier. The problem is that I'm sorry, this is the good one. So they will come back, they'll lay their eggs, and then at the right time when their babies are born, the caterpillars are going to be in abundance. So that's the ideal of this, that they're arriving, they're laying their eggs, and when the babies are born is when the insects are like fully like, they have the big insect bloom, for lack of a better term. The problem with climate change is what's happening is that this spike of caterpillars, instead of occurring when the babies are here, because it's getting warmer earlier and insects don't care about how long the day is, insects only care about temperature, they're coming out earlier so that the big bloom of insects is not happening when the baby birds need the food, it's happening when they're still in their eggs. So that's one example of how climate change is like drastically affecting like migration. It also is just, there's so many other things, but that's one of the biggest ones for at least the birds up here, because basically they're still coming back at the same time because they have had no reason to adapt so quickly to that change, but the insects are coming out earlier. It's also one of the problems, like right now, we had like 60-degree weather yesterday, hugely detrimental for frogs, because what happens is the frogs thaw, they start coming out, and then we get another freeze and they all die. Yeah, it's really, really quite tragic. And on that note, no. I'll just quickly, since we're here, things you can do to help, because that was a bleak note. You can plant native wildflowers in your yard. You can put out food if you have a cat. These silly little clown collars if you let your cat outside. You can buy bird-friendly coffee, and of course protect the seabirds. But in general, as far as winter is concerned, things you can do in the winter is put out seeds. You can have bird feeders to help the birds find food, because that's the main thing they're doing this time of year. If you have any other questions, feel free to come up to me, but that's it. Thank you all so much.